Boldwood presents I Wanted You to Know, written by Laura Pearson and read by Tamsin Kennard. Chapter 1. Jess understood all the words in the sentence, but she couldn't make them hang together properly. She looked at the doctor sitting opposite her, with his hands neatly folded in his lap. "Can you say it again?" she asked. "I'm sorry, Jessica. We've found evidence of breast cancer." Jess looked down at her feet where Edie's car seat was resting. Edie was stirring, and Jess took hold of the handle and rocked her a little, and Edie closed her eyes and went back to sleep. She was holding the edge of her knitted blanket in her tiny fist. Jess had been a mum for a handful of weeks. She was still learning, still felt untethered and lost. She'd gone to the doctor initially because she'd felt a lump when she was feeding Edie. She'd gone to the hospital clinic, ready to be told it was a blocked duct, to be told it was nothing, and sent on her way, another overcautious new mother. "Jessica, I know this is a shock. Do you have any questions for me?" Jess tried to focus on his face. He was in his 40s, she thought, with small round glasses and a receding hairline. She wanted to ask him whether he had a wife, whether he had children, whether he understood this new feeling she was grappling with, that her life was no longer her own, that she owed this tiny new person everything. She couldn't have cancer. How could she? She was a mum. She was a new mum. And she was 21 years old. "Are you sure?" she asked. The doctor's face changed a little at that. He smiled a sad smile, and she saw that he was probably very kind, that he was sorry for her. "I can show you the scan if you like. The lump you felt in your right breast, it's definitely a malignant tumour. It's roughly 30 millimetres in diameter. We hope you'll make a full recovery. But look, I don't want to bombard you with information right now. Do you have anyone with you?" Jess looked down at her sleeping baby and back up at the doctor. "Only my daughter," she said, her voice catching as if on a hook. Something about looking at Edie made it all harder, made it worse. "Asher here," the doctor said, gesturing at the nurse, who was hovering a little way behind his chair, "is going to be your breast care nurse, and she can take you into a room now for you to process this news and ask any questions you might have. Okay?" Jess nodded, and then she was being ushered out into the corridor where she'd waited 10 minutes before, making faces at Edie, back when she hadn't had cancer, or hadn't known, at least, that she had cancer. Asher put a hand on Jess's arm, the arm that wasn't carrying the car seat. It stilled her. "Let's go in here," Asher said. She pushed open the door to a small room with a sofa and an armchair. There were framed prints on the wall, cushions, a coffee table with a box of tissues on it. This was the room where they brought you after the bad news. This was where you began to come to terms with it. Cancer. Jess's grandfather had died from lung cancer when she was 15, her mum's dad, and she'd had a friend at school once whose sister had died from cancer, but she didn't know what kind. Asher put a pile of leaflets and little booklets on the table between them. "Some reading for you," she said. "Listen, I know this is a shock. I see women receiving this news all the time, but you're one of the youngest I've ever known. And your baby, still so tiny." Asher broke off, and Jess realised she was trying to hold back tears. This stranger, this nurse who dealt with cancer every day of her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little stronger. Jess realised that she hadn't cried, that she wasn't crying. And just as she thought it, Edie woke with a howl, and Jess unstrapped her and lifted her, held her to her chest and stroked her wispy hair. She lifted her top and pulled down her nursing bra and began to feed her daughter. And then it struck her. "Will I be able to keep feeding her?" she asked. Asher shook her head. "I can't say for sure. It depends what the treatment is. But if you have chemotherapy, I imagine you'll have to stop. Don't think about that now, though." Jess wanted to ask her what she should think about. Her head was a mess, her thoughts jumping from one thing to another. Cancer. The question she really wanted to ask was whether or not she was going to die, whether this tiny baby who needed her for every little thing would have to learn to live without her. But she didn't know what words to use, and she was frightened of the answer. "I can't tell my mum," Jess said. "Why not?" "I just can't. I'm an only child and my dad's not really been in my life. It's just the two of us. Well, the three of us now. She won't be able to deal with it." Asha pressed her lips together and tilted her head to one side. "Try not to worry about other people. For now, just think about dealing with this news yourself. It's a big blow, Jessica. It's okay to be upset or angry. It's okay to fall apart." But it wasn't, Jess thought. It wasn't okay to fall apart when you had a baby. "Is the baby's father—" Asha didn't finish the sentence, though Jess gave her plenty of time to. "He's not around," she said, when Asha's discomfort became too much. "He's not in our lives, and he never will be." "Okay," Asha said. "So what does your support network look like?" Jess thought about that. She lived with her mother in a small town in Cheshire, had always lived with her mother, apart from the couple of years she'd spent away at university, and even then she'd always come home at holidays and for the odd weekend. Her mother was her support network, wasn't she? But could one person be an entire network? There was Gemma, too. They'd been best friends for years, since the early days of secondary school, and they'd known one another for years before that. Gemma was caught up in most of Jess's memories of being a teenager, and she'd been great throughout the pregnancy and since Edie had been born. She told Asha about her mother and her best friend, and it didn't seem like a lot suddenly. She felt as though she should have more people to offer up. "There's my dad," she said eventually. "I didn't grow up with him, but he lives nearby. I see him now and again." Asha smiled. "Okay," she said. "Well, I think we've told you everything you need to know for today. There'll be more tests, I'm afraid, but we can get in touch about those. I'd advise you to go home and break the news to those people you've just told me about. You're going to need their help and support more than ever now. How are you getting home?" "I'm driving," Jess said. She'd borrowed her mum's car for the appointment. She'd said she needed a few bits and pieces in town. It had felt easier at the time than explaining. "And are you sure you're okay going home on your own?" Jess looked down at Edie, who'd finished feeding and was lying in her arms, her face all contentment. She wanted to say that she wasn't on her own, that she was with Edie. But she just nodded and thanked Asha as she strapped Edie back into her car seat. When she got outside and the cool winter air hit her face, Jess stood still and inhaled it for a moment. And then, just as she was about to struggle to the car park with Edie's car seat in the crook of her elbow, she heard her name and turned, and Asha was behind her. "You forgot these," she said, brandishing the pile of leaflets. "And I've written down my number. You can call me if you think of any questions or if you want to talk to someone." "Thank you," Jess said, putting the car seat down and stuffing the paper into the changing bag. It seemed, for a minute, as if Asha was going to say something else, but then she just rested a hand briefly on Jess's arm again before dashing back inside. It wasn't until she was in the car, Edie secured and her own seatbelt on, that she cried. Cancer. There was something about that word. It reeked of death, and it was for old people, people who'd lived, not women who were just starting out, not new mums. Jess cried hard for 20 minutes, until her eyes were sore from it and she felt empty. In the back of the car, Edie slept on, oblivious. And then, feeling that it was out of her system, Jess turned the engine on and drove, slowly, back home. When she got there, she sat in the driveway for a while, feeling like she lacked the energy to move. It was peaceful with Edie sleeping. The jolt of removing the car seat from the car might wake her. Why not sit for a while? Cancer. Breast cancer. Jess reached down and touched the place where she'd found the lump. It was close into the nipple, hard to the touch. She wondered why she'd never noticed it before, or whether it had only recently become pronounced enough to be felt. She'd always had fairly small breasts, and then in pregnancy they'd become much larger, and now that she was feeding, they were sore and variable, Rock hard when Edie was due a feed, and then soft as soon as she was finished. She'd been so sure that this lump was a part of that, part of those changes. She'd been so sure. Jess knew that her mum was out, that she was at work. She worked in a call centre answering the phone for hundreds of small companies and passing on messages. Jess didn't always know what shifts she was doing, but she knew she was at work that afternoon. She'd gone on the bus because Jess was using the car. So when Edie opened her eyes and Jess carried her inside the house, she knew it was empty. And part of her was glad, because she wasn't ready yet to share this news with anyone else. But part of her was sad and felt horribly alone. For the first time in weeks, she thought about calling Jake, and then she gathered herself. She put Edie in her bouncy chair, carried it into the bathroom and had a shower, avoiding the lump when she covered her body with shower gel. She washed her hair. When she stepped out, dripping wet, and reached for a towel, a few drops of water fell onto Edie's head, and she did a funny little wriggle. Jess laughed. It was so hard, being a new mum, and yet every day, every hour almost, Edie did something to make her laugh, and Jess remembered to be grateful for her, remembered that she'd made the right decision when those 2 lines had turned blue. She might be missing out on her final year of university, but she was doing something else, something better. Or she had been. Now she wasn't sure what she was doing, or how long she had left to do anything. "I want to promise you things," Jess said. "I thought I could promise to always be here with you, but now I don't know." She knew that tears were coming again. "Edie, you're my love, my big love, and I'll do anything I can to make sure I'm here to look after you. But if I can't do that, I'll make everything right for you for when I'm gone. I'll make sure you're always looked after by people who love you." She would wait for her mum to come home, she decided. And then she'd sit her down and tell her, and her mum would know what to do. That was how it worked with mums. Jess wondered for a moment whether Edie would feel that way about her when she was an adult, whether she would believe that Jess had the answer to everything. And then the thought struck her hard that she might not be around to see Edie as a grown-up, and she sank onto her bed, a towel around her body and her hair still dripping. Edie in that chair, playing with her fingers, and the cancer inside her, growing. Chapter 2. Dear Edie, I wanted you to know how I met your dad. I'd just started university in Manchester, and I got a job at the supermarket near my halls, operating the checkouts for a few shifts a week. On my first day, the manager gave me a tour, and we ran into your dad. He was stacking shelves. Soup, I think.
"Jessica, this is Jake. He's been with us a couple of months now."
I smiled, and your dad put his hand out to shake mine.
"Hi, Jessica,"
he said, and that was it. His hand was warm and slightly dry, and I could feel the skin was a little rough in places. There was something about the sound of my name in his mouth that made it seem new. And then the manager moved on to cleaning products, and I followed him. I tried really hard not to look back over my shoulder, but I did, and your dad had gone back to what he was doing. I wondered whether meeting me had had any impact whatsoever on his day. Every time I went in for a shift, I thought about him, about whether he'd be there. But it was a pretty big place, and he always seemed to be stacking shelves or marking down reduced items or shifting things around, while I was on the tills. More than once, I caught a glimpse of him just as I was leaving, and I felt irrationally cross that I hadn't seen him earlier, though God knows I wouldn't have said anything to him if I had. I told my friend Gemma about him in a letter. We'd written notes to each other throughout school, and I wanted that to carry on. Gemma thought I was mad and always replied by text. Anyway, I told her I couldn't stop thinking about him, and that I'd barely met him, and he'd said about 2 words to me, and I'd said nothing in reply. Gemma was bolder than me, more worldly somehow, even though we'd both lived in the same little town our whole lives, until I'd gone away to university. She asked me what he looked like. It was hard to describe him. He wasn't especially tall, he wasn't fat or thin. I couldn't remember the colour of his eyes, and his hair was brown, that most nondescript of colours. The following weekend, I arrived at work and he was standing outside, leaning against the side of the building, smoking a cigarette. I felt my face start to flush, and I turned my head to the side, hoping he wouldn't see.
"Jessica," he said. "Jess?"
It was a miracle to me that he'd half remembered my name, even though his had been going through my mind for weeks, crowding out my reading and my half-finished essay. I turned back to him, willing my skin to return to its usual colour. I said he could call me Jess. He repeated it, and again it sounded like an entirely different name to the one I'd carried around with me for 18 years.
"Have a nice day, Jess."
Edie, when you meet someone you really like and every minute is spent wanting them to notice you, a few words mean everything. My craving was sated, but as soon as he was gone, it returned. I was desperate to know when I'd get to talk to him again, whether I would have to wait another 6 weeks. I went inside, hung my coat up on the usual peg and started my shift. But the dissatisfaction lingered. It was winter, but not the good part when Christmas is coming and everyone is feeling festive and throwing parties and eating too much. It was January, the bleakest month, when no one has any money and spring seems a long way away. I only lived a 10-minute walk from the supermarket, but I remember my toes would feel frozen solid by the time I got back to my little room. I used to walk home as fast as I could, my hands rammed deep in my pockets, my hood up against the wind. One day, I was nearly there when I heard a car pull to a stop at the side of me. I turned to look, and it was him. He was driving a red Volkswagen, and when he wound down the window, I heard a blast of something loud from his stereo. He said my name, asked if I wanted a lift. I thought about getting into that car beside him, about how our bodies would be closer than they'd ever been before, and how I would get to learn what music he was listening to, and whether he was neat or untidy, and how well he drove. I was still young enough that having your own car seemed very adult to me. I was living on very little money, and owning something that big seemed so far away, almost exotic. I thanked him and said that it was okay, that I was nearly home. I don't know why I said it. I had been wanting something like this to happen for weeks, and now it had, and I'd pushed it away. It was something I did, something I've always done. But I'm trying to do it less, as I come to understand that opportunities don't always continue to present themselves. All my life, I've tried to train myself to reach out and grab the things I want with both hands. He shrugged and wound his window back up, and then he was gone, and it took a moment for me to realise that I should start walking again. When I talked to Gemma, she always asked me how it was going with Jake, and I told her the tiny scraps of progress I had made. We had exchanged a few words outside the building one morning. He had offered me a lift home. She sighed loudly when I told her I'd said no. She told me I was useless, that we needed to do something about this, that she would visit and we'd have a party. At home, Gemma lived on the other side of town from me, in a small, squat house with her parents and her older brother, Dan. Gemma's parties were popular because her parents didn't seem to mind going out and leaving the house in the hands of a group of drunk teenagers, and the neighbours rarely complained. And Dan was either busy or he just joined in. It was the rougher end of town, and arguments and parties were more frequent. People were used to noise. They didn't complain because next week it might be them, and they didn't want the complaint to bounce back. I thought about what kind of party she might arrange here, with only my small room in Halls to host it. I wanted to say no, but she never responded well to that. When she arrived a couple of weeks later, she looked around as if she thought the room might open up a little on closer inspection, then said that drinks in the pub would have to do. When I left her to go and do my shift, she told me to mention the drinks to Jake and some of the others. I wondered what she thought it was like, whether she imagined there were crowds of us working there, making plans to socialise in the evenings. When I said I couldn't do it, she rolled her eyes and said I should leave it to her. And I believed that she would think of something. She was the kind of girl who made things happen. She turned up later that day, and it was quiet, so we chatted for a while at my till. And when Jake walked past, I cleared my throat to alert her to the fact that this was him, the person we'd spent all this time talking about. but I needn't have done, because they made eye contact and they both smiled.
Gemma Kershaw?
He asked, his head tilted slightly to one side. Jake Burton! He came closer, and it looked like they might hug, but then they didn't, and it was a little awkward. Jess, Gemma said, turning to me. You remember Jake, right? From school? From school? My head was spinning. This wasn't right. I was the one who knew Jake, who was supposed to be introducing him to my friend. We were 30 miles from where Gemma and I went to school. How could Jake have gone there too? I'd completely forgotten that this was where you moved, Gemma was saying. You remember Jess, don't you? At last, Jake and I made eye contact.
I didn't remember,
he said, and then he dropped his eyes to the floor, as if he'd said something he was ashamed of.
But we know each other now, a bit.
Well, listen, we're going out for drinks tonight. Will you come? Bring some friends if you want to.
Cool, I'll give you my number.
He pulled a tatty piece of paper from his pocket, and I handed him a pen. And when he took it from me, his fingers brushed mine, and I felt a shiver, and wondered whether he felt something too. He passed the piece of paper to Gemma and disappeared. As he was walking away, Gemma and I widened our eyes at each other, and when he'd gone, we both collapsed into laughter. I can't believe you've come away to uni, and you've got a crush on someone we went to school with for years. I was trying to remember whether he had seemed familiar to me, now that I knew. Gemma's brother seemed to have played football with pretty much everyone, so Gemma knew a lot more people than I did. So what? His family moved here? I was still trying to puzzle it all out. Yes, after his GCSEs, I think. His dad got a new job or something. She paused, then went on. You know, I kissed him once, at a party. I didn't say anything, but I was devastated. I'd felt almost like I'd discovered him, like he'd always been standing by the tins of soup in that supermarket, had never been a little boy or a young teenager kissing girls at parties. There was so much I wanted to know and couldn't find the words to ask, like whether he was a good kisser, or why I'd never heard about him before. Edie, I'm sure there are things that are uncomfortable for you here. Imagining your dad kissing Gemma, for a start. Thinking about us as young and vulnerable and romantic. Try to bear it and keep reading. It's important. When I'd finished my shift, I hurried back to my room to get ready. Gemma was in the kitchen I shared with 7 other girls, drinking tea with a couple of them. She'd invited them along. I felt sick with nerves. It was entirely possible that Jake and I wouldn't speak that night, or that he wouldn't even come, and yet I somehow knew that it wouldn't go like that. I'd already decided what to wear, chosen my favourite pair of jeans and a black top that Gemma always said looked good on me. It had thin straps and it was silky, and another boy at another party had told me I looked sexy in it, and so it made me feel sexy. It made me feel like someone else. I got dressed too early, brushed my long dark hair until it shone. I put on some makeup and took it off again, thinking it was too much, and started again, more careful and sparing the second time. All the time, Gemma and I talked and laughed, and she showed me the text messages she and Jake had sent each other that day. He was coming. He was bringing a friend. Gemma said she hoped the friend was hot. She'd arranged to meet him at 8. At 7:30, I wrapped a chunky scarf around my neck and put my coat and boots on, and then I walked to the pub with my arm linked through Gemma's, feeling like I was heading towards a new beginning. Or do I only remember it that way now, knowing what I do? I suppose it doesn't matter much. Gemma was wearing a red dress that showed off her hips and her boobs, both of which were large, but not too large. She had bright red lipstick on, and there was a smudge of it on her teeth, and I didn't tell her, and I wasn't sure why. She looked so glamorous, and I kept thinking about what she'd said, about kissing Jake once at a party, and I couldn't bear to imagine that it might happen again. Not that she was interested in him. She had a boyfriend that winter called Mark, who was at college studying engineering. He smoked a lot of weed and took her to bars in the next town, and they were having sex. She talked a lot about the sex they were having, how much and how long and how big. I'd never had sex. I'd had the opportunity a couple of times, but it had never felt right somehow. I was scared of it, to be honest. It seemed like a line you couldn't cross back from, which it is, of course. I was stuck, in a way, desperate to be more adult, but terrified too. I wasn't ready for a proper job or responsibilities, and I lumped sex in with all of that as another thing that grown-ups did, something I would do eventually. Gemma and I had had a couple of drinks while we were getting ready. I loved the warm feeling that alcohol gave me. Just halfway through my first bottle of beer, I'd begun to relax, felt my confidence growing. Gemma had pulled a bottle of vodka from her bag and held it up to me, her eyebrows raised, but I'd shaken my head. A few times when we were at school, I'd misjudged it and gone from being cute and bubbly to blotchy and drunk before we'd even arrived at the party or pub. I wanted to pace myself that night. When we arrived at the pub, Gemma looked around for Jake, but I knew he wasn't there. I could sense it, and I sensed it when he walked in, too. The hairs on my arms went up. I wonder whether you'll laugh at this, whether you'll think I'm making it up. I promise I'm not. We didn't talk for ages. Gemma talked to him and flirted with his friend, and I just stood there, feeling stupid. Jake and I exchanged quiet smiles. And then a couple of hours into the evening, I went outside for a breather, the alcohol masking the cold. I leaned against the outside wall of the pub, feeling tears prick at my eyes. I'd really hoped that something might happen. Gemma had got me all excited, and I'd been stupid and had started to believe. I blinked away the tears, counted to 10, told myself I would go back inside and keep pretending that everything was fine. But I only took a couple of steps because then the door opened and Jake came out. I hoped he would come over and hoped he wouldn't. For a second, I thought I might be sick, and then I was fine again.
"Jess,"
he said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on mine. He was walking towards me, and he didn't stop when I expected him to. Didn't stop until he was inches from my body. I wondered whether he'd had too much to drink, whether he could hide it in his voice but wasn't quite so in control when it came to his movements. I said hi, my voice a croak. For a moment we just looked at each other, and I thought he was going to kiss me. I readied myself, licked my lips, and then he didn't kiss me, and I felt stupid and disappointed and cold suddenly. I shivered. He asked me who I was, and when I said I didn't know what he meant, he leaned closer still and said he didn't know anything about me. I was flustered. I started to tell him about my course, about my room in halls. And then he did kiss me, and I wasn't ready for it, and although I'd thought about it for a long time and it felt wonderful, I couldn't stop thinking about him kissing Gemma like this, in some other garden at some other party. He put his arms around me, wrapped his coat around the two of us. Although I felt so sure about him, that kiss somehow didn't feel like it was the start of something, like it would lead to all this, to you. Perhaps because I didn't dare to believe. It was just a kiss, a drunken kiss, I kept telling myself. It wasn't a relationship, wasn't a date. This is what we did, all of us, to pass the time. We got drunk and we kissed, because there was nothing else to do. And we were teenagers, with hormones running wild. It was just a kiss. I wanted you to know how I met your dad. We met at a supermarket, and then at a pub. With love, Mum. Chapter 3. The following day, Jess was in the living room with Edie when she heard her mum's key in the lock. They were lying on their backs on the brightly coloured playmat Gemma had bought when Edie was born. Jess was holding things out to her daughter, seeing if she would take them. Edie was waving her hands around. Jess braced herself. She heard her mum come inside, heard her unzip her coat. Any minute now, she'd enter the room. "I'm back," Caroline said. "How are you two?" Jess sat up and picked up Edie. She needed to have Edie close, she felt. Edie was her protection somehow. "I need to talk to you about something. Shall I make us a cup of tea?" They went through to the kitchen, and Jess's mum, Caroline, kept asking questions. "Is it Edie? Is there something wrong?" That gave Jess pause. At least it isn't Edie, she thought. At least it wasn't her baby. But for her mum, it was her baby. Hadn't her mum always said, when she was 3 and 14 and 20, that Jess would always be her baby? That's just how it was once you had children. Jess flicked the kettle on and grabbed mugs from the cupboard with one hand, holding Edie in place with the other. She was getting better at this, but her mum held out her arms regardless, and Jess put Edie in them. "Edie's fine. Just give me a minute." When the tea was made and Jess had taken a packet of biscuits from the cupboard and she and her mum were sitting down, there was really nothing more she could do to put it off. "I went to the hospital yesterday," she said. "I thought you were going shopping," her mum interrupted. "I know, I didn't want to tell you in case it was nothing. But it isn't, so now I have to." Caroline's hands flew to her mouth, and Jess felt for a moment as though she wasn't in the room, but somewhere slightly above it, watching it. And she thought about how her mum was reacting the way you see people reacting to bad news in films or on TV. And she wondered how this could be her life, their lives, and how it could be that the news she had to impart was going to take a hammer to this cosy domestic scene and tear things apart. "I've got breast cancer," Jess said. The words were a jumble, and she hoped her mum would have heard her correctly, hoped she wouldn't have to say them again. "Breast cancer," her mum repeated, and Jess nodded. "But you're 21. Jess closed her eyes for a second. She wanted to say that it wasn't helpful to remind her of her age, that it wasn't helpful to disbelieve the news she'd just imparted. But she didn't have the energy. Her mum had always been a bit like this. When she had told her mum that she was pregnant, that she was dropping out of university to have the baby, she'd been a bit like this. And then the news had been about a new life and not about an illness. Nothing like this. "Jessica, is this really happening?" Jess nodded, and when her mum stood up, she thought she was going to give her a hug, but she was trying to pass Edie back to her. Jess took her. She was half asleep, groggy, and she objected to the discomfort of being passed from person to person with a little whimper. Jess looked down at her daughter and promised her, silently, that she would never behave this way. That if she was lucky enough to survive into Edie's adulthood, and Edie came to her with something like this, she would be calm and supportive, full of love. "How much do you know? What's the treatment plan?" Caroline asked. She'd sat back down now that she didn't have Edie to hold, and she looked like she had hundreds of questions like this, ready to fire. She was crying too, and Jess realised that she hadn't cried all that much, but she thought she might soon. "I don't know anything, Mum. It was a shock." "But didn't you ask?" "No, I didn't ask. I was on my own with Edie, and it was a horrible shock. I couldn't take it in. Even now, I don't know what the right questions are." There was a long beat of silence, and Jess could feel her mother's disapproval. She wanted to ask her mum to hold her in her arms, to tell her it would be okay, to tell her she would help her through it. But Caroline was up on her feet again, pacing the room. "I had an aunt with breast cancer. Do you remember? Penny. She used to live up near the school. We took a casserole round once when she'd been in hospital." Jess didn't remember, but she thought there was little point in saying that. When her mum was fixed on something like this, she often didn't need input. "She died," Caroline said softly. And suddenly, Jess couldn't take it. She needed to be out of the house, away from the walls which she could feel pushing in on her. She needed to breathe some fresh air and be alone. "I'm going to take Edie for a walk," she said. If her mum heard the shake in her voice, she didn't mention it. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. Jess shook her head. "I'm okay," she said. It took a while to get the two of them ready. Jess put her coat and scarf on, and she put Edie in a snowsuit. She'd never worn it before, and it was too big, her limbs not quite reaching the suit's arm and leg holes. Jess lay her daughter flat in her pram, tucked a blanket around her. She bent to give Edie a kiss, and a tear fell from her face and landed on her daughter's, and she knew she had to get out quickly, because it was starting. She didn't want to examine her reluctance to let her mother see her crumble. Jess opened the door, and she heard her mum calling something to her, but she pushed the pram out and closed the door behind her without looking back. The tears were coming fast now, and she hurried to the end of the road, only slowing her pace when she knew she'd gone too far to be followed. A memory came to her of being 6 or 7, curling up with her mum on the sofa to watch a quiz show they both liked. Her mum would call out the answers, and Jess never knew any of them. But she liked the presenter, who always wore sparkly dresses and had the most beautiful curly hair Jess had ever seen. There was a catchphrase from the show, something about making it count, and Jess would sometimes shout it down the stairs when she was supposed to be asleep, and her mum would come upstairs to tell her to get back to bed, but she would be laughing, and they would always have an extra cuddle. Edie was asleep. The gentle movement of the pram had soothed her. She was a good baby, Jess thought, although she had nothing to compare her to. She was happy, easy to love. Jess had thought about not having her. She'd been 20, 2 years into a degree, and unexpectedly pregnant. She'd thought about making the whole situation go away. She knew others who'd done that, knew that it was an option. She didn't think it was wrong, but somehow she'd known that she didn't want to do that. It hadn't been what she'd planned, but it had been what was happening, and she'd decided to just go with it. Jess looked up. She'd barely noticed where she was going, stopping now and then to cross roads carefully, turning this way or that without much thought. She was near her old primary school. One of the windows was covered in red and green handprints. In a few years, Edie would be in one of those classrooms, learning her letters and numbers. Jess looked down at her peaceful sleeping face all that was visible, and tried to imagine her at 4 years old. Jess had a hazy memory of her first day at school. Her mum had always said that she couldn't possibly, but she did. She remembered standing in the playground and her socks slipping down her legs, having to bend to pull them up. What would Edie look like in a grey skirt and knee-length socks? And would Jess be there to see it? Jess's mind kept flitting back to Jake. In the early days of her pregnancy, she'd dared to imagine the two of them doing this together, but it hadn't worked out like that. She remembered coming home that weekend, telling her mum, the way her mum had said they would look after the baby between them, and who needed men anyway. Sometimes Jess scanned Edie's face for signs of Jake. They were there, in her dark eyes and the shape of her chin, and Jess marvelled again and again at the fact that they had made a human, unwittingly, in those long days and nights they'd spent in bed together, that Edie was part her and part him, that she was theirs. She'd left after a huge row with Jake about their future. Neither of them had had this in their plan, but while she'd quickly adapted to the idea of it, he'd refused to, was unable to, possibly, definitely unwilling. And she'd been so furious, all her fear of losing him turned to rage, that she'd said things that couldn't be unsaid and cut off all contact. And now he was travelling around the country, trying to get a music career off the ground, trying to make a mark. How could she interrupt that with news like this? I have cancer. She couldn't. She wouldn't. And yet... Edie snuffled and woke, just as they were walking past the park, its equipment dripping with the rain that had fallen overnight. Jess had never pushed Edie on a swing, never held her hand as she went down a slide. When did all that start, she wondered? When they could sit up, when they could crawl or walk? She asked her mum sometimes about things like that, and Caroline would wave her hand and say she couldn't possibly remember. She would ask the health visitor, she thought, next time she got Edie weighed. She would ask how long she had to wait before she could push her daughter on a swing. Jess turned for home when Edie began to cry. She was hungry, and Jess didn't want to sit and feed her on a wet bench. As Edie's cries grew in force and volume, Jess pushed the pram a little faster. They went past the church, past the Chinese takeaway and the Tesco Express. They were 5 minutes from home, and Edie was wailing now, and it was only then that Jess noticed her own tears had stopped. She put a hand to her face, wondered if it was red and puffy. As soon as they made it through the front door into the warmth of the house, Jess began pulling off their outer layers, knowing that Edie would be calm as soon as she put her to her breast. But before she could do it, Caroline swooped out into the hallway, reaching for Edie. "There you are, my darling. What is it, hey?" Caroline held Edie close, and Edie turned her head, butting her forehead against Caroline's chest. "Give her to me, Mum. She's hungry." Caroline handed Edie over, her face a little hurt. "I wish you'd let me feed her sometimes. It would give you a break." "How can I let you feed her when she's breastfed?" Jess's voice was sharper than she'd intended. Caroline held up both of her hands and backed into the kitchen, and Jess heard the sound of the kettle beginning to boil. She clamped Edie to her breast and went through to the lounge, sinking into the armchair. She was shattered. She'd fed Edie 3 times in the night, and between feeds she'd lain awake, wondering what all of this meant, what she should do. When Caroline came into the lounge with a mug in each hand, Jess smiled at her. "Sorry," she said. She'd got herself all worked up and it got to me. "Love, are we going to pretend that none of this is happening?" "None of what?" Jess asked, trying to keep her voice level. "The cancer. I'm not pretending anything. I still have to look after my baby, don't I?" Caroline shook her head, as if this wasn't true. "I'm thinking about getting in touch with Jake," Jess said. And then she wasn't sure whether she'd said it to antagonise her mother or because it was true. Caroline sighed. "Why on earth would you do that? He obviously knows you've had her by now, and he hasn't been in touch, has he? I can't see him rushing to your rescue." Jess said nothing. There was so much her mum didn't know, couldn't know. The way Jake had looked at her when they woke up together in the mornings. The way he reached out to touch her face or took a strand of her hair between 2 fingers, as if he was checking she was real. The way he'd made her laugh, telling her stories about his childhood. The way they'd laughed together, eyes full of tears. The way he'd seemed to get beneath all the layers and really understood her, even when she was trying to hide from him. The day Edie had been born, Jess had been desperate to call him, to show him. But she was exhausted from the labour, and she'd fallen asleep, her mum sitting in the corner of the room with Edie in her arms. And when she'd woken up, it hadn't seemed like such a good idea after all. "I think I'm going to go and have a lie down with her," Jess said. "I didn't get much sleep, and she'll go off after this feed." "OK," Caroline said. She sounded almost put out, and Jess had to stop herself from asking what the problem was. She knew that the lack of sleep made her snappy, and she tried hard to keep it in check. Upstairs, she pulled back the bed covers and got in with Edie, who'd finished feeding and was half asleep. Jess watched her, the way her face twitched and changed every few seconds, until she fell asleep herself. She woke to a harsh ringing sound and realised it was her phone. She managed to answer it before it disturbed Edie. "Hello?" It was almost a whisper. "It's me," Gemma said. "Can I come over later?" Jess had missed Gemma every day when she was at university, and when she'd come back, without a degree and pregnant, they'd fallen back into their old ways, spending weekends and many evenings together, just without all the alcohol, at least for Jess. Gemma had simply shrugged when Jess had told her she was pregnant, and Jess had loved her for that. She often felt that without Gemma, she would go mad. "Yes, come," she said. "Straight after work?" "I'll bring a pizza." Jess hung up and looked at her watch. It was almost lunchtime. Her mind whirred through a few things. Her mum, and whether she might be going out to work in a bit. And then it settled on Jake again, and Jess was surprised, and she checked whether she still had his number in her phone, knowing all the while that she did. Chapter 4. Dear Edie, I wanted you to know about the first proper argument I had with your dad. It's important that you see things from both sides. I sometimes make our love story sound like a fairy tale, and it was sometimes, but it wasn't always. It was 6 months or so after that first kiss, and we'd been pretty much inseparable. We timed our breaks at work and stood outside, whatever the weather, just kissing. Occasionally, the manager would stick his head out of the door to tut at us. There was nothing he could do, but he obviously thought it was important to show his contempt for the situation. We bickered occasionally, but only about silly things. What to see at the cinema, or whose turn it was to buy the drinks. We didn't have much money, either of us. He was working at the supermarket full-time, but it didn't pay much. I thought it was just a stopgap sort of a job. He made me think it was. He talked a lot about his big plans to play in a band and travel the world. We didn't talk about what would happen when I'd finish university. It was summer, and we were in love, and life was good. Your dad played guitar. He often picked it up when we were at the house he lived in with his parents, holed up in his room. He sang me songs by bands like The Cure and In Excess. I thought he was good. He had a soft voice, but there was something underneath it, something raw and rough, and you could just make it out when he sang. It was different to other voices I'd heard. I thought he would make it. I asked him whether he'd ever tried writing his own songs, and he shrugged me off. He just talked big about making an album, getting a drummer and a bassist to work with, and hiring a recording studio. One afternoon, when I'd finished lectures for the day and your dad was at work, I was wandering around town. I'd been thinking that I wanted to get him something, but I only had a few pounds, and I couldn't think how to make it stretch to buy anything worthwhile. I was walking past the library when I saw a notice in the window. A local band was looking for a lead guitarist and singer. They listed bands they wanted to sound like, bands I'd listened to in your dad's bedroom, names I'd seen on posters on his wall. It was perfect. It wasn't a present as such, but I genuinely believed it might be the start of his future, and I was so proud that I'd seen it. I pulled a notebook and pen out of my bag and wrote down all the details. I looked at my watch. There were another 2 hours to go before the end of your dad's shift. I didn't go home. I just killed time, going in and out of shops, impatient to break the news. When there was only half an hour to go, I walked to the supermarket. It was a warm day, no breeze, and my hair felt heavy on the back of my neck when I got there. I lifted it up with both hands and then let it drop. There was a wall around the car park, and I sat on it. I pulled a book from my bag. I think it was Dickens. I had a seminar about it the following day, and I had 200 pages left to read. I was finding it hard going. I stopped at the end of every couple of pages and looked at my watch. I wanted to tell him about the band, but I wanted to see him too. I wanted to feel his arms around me, the way he laced his fingers together at the small of my back. And then finally he stepped outside, his eyes adjusting to the bright sun. I jumped up and waved, and he smiled lazily, and it was enough to tell me he was glad to see me. When he reached me, I let it all out in one breath. I was dancing around, moving my face ever closer to his, waiting for his kiss. "Give me a minute," he said. And there was a sharpness in his voice that I hadn't heard before, and I stopped moving, but stayed close to him. He said sorry.